name is Eric Michael Loyd. I have a master's in psychology, neuropsychology concentration. It's Saturday, June 7th, 10:22 p.m. Just did a little bit of breath work, meditation, or deep breathing exercise. Honestly feel pretty good. I bet. I did want to read an article. This is from the journal Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology, Minor Psychology. The DOI is 10.1037 /A 0020655. This article was written in 2010, published on pmc.ncbi.nlm.nih.gov. The title is Anger Suppression, Interdependent Self-Construal, and Depression Among Asian American and European American College Students. Author Rebecca Chung, J.K. Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology. I'm going to go ahead and read the abstract because something had me thinking about this a lot. The present study tested a theoretical model of emotion regulation, Yap, Schieber, and Allen, 2007, in a sample of Asian American and European American college students, N is equal to 365, specifically the mediating role of anger suppression in the effect of temperament and family processes on depressive symptoms was tested across race and levels of interdependent self-construal. That's how one sees itself. A culturally based self-orientation emphasizing connectedness with others. Next, the moderation of the suppression-depression relation was tested by race and interdependent self-construal. Results indicated that the hypothesized model fit well across Asian American and European American students, as well as those with high versus low levels of interdependent self-construal. Anger suppression was a significant mediator of the hypothesized indirect effects on depressive symptoms. Moreover, race and interdependent self-construal moderated the suppression-depression link, such that Asian American status and a stronger interdependent self-construal attenuated the relationship between anger suppression and depressive symptoms. So there is some relation between anger suppression and depression. However, in Asian American students, having a stronger self-construal, interdependent self-construal between you and another person, that modified the relationship between the effect that suppressing anger had on depression or depressive symptoms. Understanding both universal and cultural specific aspects of emotion regulation in the development of depressive symptoms will be essential for sound theory, future research, and effective prevention and intervention efforts across diverse populations. I think this is one reason why I was drawn to catharsis. Sometimes it's something I engage in as well when things get stressful. I believe it's a purging of emotions, purifies oneself. It could seem um, uh, wacky, out of control. However, if you have knowledge of it and what it is and what it's not, then I think that it's construed differently. And that's how I would like it to be thought of with myself. So I believe that people should try to engage in self-control as well. But I do realize the human aspect of people, and I don't believe in trying to put people in boxes and suffocating people. So with that said, I mean, if you engage in it, some sort of expression of your emotion, I think that that's okay. And as long as, I believe nobody's actually offended by it, they know your intention, and they know what your intention is not. And perhaps if you don't disturb people too much with it, maybe it would work for you. Now, I'd say use that with caution. I would say ask your doctor or psychologist or the people that you live with or work with. But I do still see that cathartic event has a benefit to people as it did 20 years ago. It goes on to say, emotion dysregulation is a central feature of psychological disorders and has gained increasing scientific attention in attempts to better understand the development of psychopathology. Now, this is the job that we have, that we do. However, I believe there are limits to everything. Right? There's limitations to people. I think we should accept those limitations and continue to foster growth and health unconditionally. That might not be the easiest thing to do all the time, but I think if people know that you're working towards similar goals that they have and intentions that they have, I think that that's the human aspect that shines through with everyone, especially in the stressful day-to-day life that we have today. Trying to keep up with things, financial health, emotional health, psychological health, being with family, relationship success, cultivating those relations, maintaining your health, the myriad of ways to do that, and continuing to go out there and give your best every single day, no matter what. Sometimes it could build up, and I'm not one to say that, that's bad or this is bad. Of course, if I'm caught off guard with it, then, I might be, a little cathartic myself, but at least we know each other that way, right? Emotion suppression, going on to read the article, is one common form of unhealthy emotion regulation. Okay, that's by John and Gross, 2004. Habitual suppressors experience more negative emotions, less positive emotions, and feelings of inauthenticity. That's Gross and John, 2003. In terms of psychological maladjustment and well-being, suppression is associated with higher levels of depressive symptoms and lower levels of life satisfaction. That's Gross and John, 2003. Suppression is also associated with less social support. Gross and John, 2003. Decreased cognitive resources, Gross and Levinson, 1997, and greater sympathetic activation of the ectodermal and cardiovascular systems, Gross, 1998. So sympathetic activation of the cardiovascular and electrodermal systems, that's basically getting someone aroused, basically. Like when you go out and exercise or you go out and do something, your sympathetic nervous system is what arouses the person, gets their heart beating and everything like that, the blood flowing. But it's also associated with decreased cognitive resources. And then less social support. So I don't believe that people should suppress their emotions and then what they state is worse, what the psychological research say is worse, is repression. So that's suppression is active. So theoretically, in the research, it says that suppression is a little bit better than repression. Repression is not within your control. Repression is unconscious, suppressing emotions. That's just speaking in broad terms. Everything has to be on a case-by-case basis. Some people might be different. Some people maybe have different genes, different environments, different ways of looking at things. This is just in general what the research says. It's a blanket statement. Thus, despite its common use, emotion suppression contains psychological, social, cognitive, and physiological costs. So that's even a person actively suppressing their emotions has a cost. Psychologically, socially, cognitively, being able to do things, executive functions, and physiological costs, like the body, the physiology of the body. I think of, trying to own a business, trying to be the best family member I can, trying to expand, and trying to complete many of the projects that I have going at the same time. And I think of all of those costs as well. I'm not justifying anything, I'm just stating the facts. And I'm a big believer in longevity. I think everyone could live to 100 if they take care of themselves. It's just what I think. And then perhaps that's just one of the ways to do it. If you're already doing the exercise, you're already hanging out with your family, you're already eating right, you're already going to work, you're already putting yourself out there, you're already learning a new thing, reading, hanging out with friends, then, it could be another thing in your arsenal. But I'd be careful on how one does engage in catharsis and where one does engage in catharsis. Because people have to know what you're doing, because people, naturally people, the fear factor kicks in. People don't, it looks weird, they're not used to that, it throws them off. They're not in if you're not in a psychological setting or with your therapist or counselor or psychologist, that could also throw people off as well, could be disturbing. But again, I think using things with caution is a good thing to do. So we're going on to read the research again. It says, at the same time, several gaps exist in current literature. So that's on suppression. First, scholars, example, John and Gross, 2004, have called for, quote, deepening research that focuses on the regulation of discrete emotions. So that's anger or sadness, moving beyond emotion regulation in general terms. Second, there are relatively few theory-driven studies examining how emotion regulation serves as an explanatory mechanism in the etiology of specific psychological disorders such as depression. So much of the research that deals with the theory behind how regulating one's emotions connects with specific psychological disorders is lacking, and how those disorders connect with depression. So third, there is a paucity, dearth, a lack of research examining potential between group variations incorporating race, ethnicity, and culture, particularly in terms of meaningful underlying psychological processes. Betancourt and Lopez, 1993, quote, or active cultural ingredients, end quote. Matsumoto and Yo, 2006. So some of it's referencing research that's 20 years old. However, this is a good starting point, perhaps, to look to see if that research on theory-driven studies on how emotional regulation connects to psychological disorders and depression exist. That would be a good thing to look up as well, just to educate oneself. And then between group variations. So within a group, it would be like African Americans within that group, whatever specific question it is. Between group is between, let's say, African Americans and European Americans, or between African Americans and Korean Americans, or between all three and Indian Native Americans. So that's between group variations. So the differences between groups. The present study aimed to address these gaps by 1. Honing in on the regulation of anger. 2. Testing anger suppression as a mediating explanatory mechanism in the relation between family processes, temperament, and depression. And 3. Investigating racial and cultural variations in the anger suppression depression link among Asian American and European American college students. So I did read an article maybe a couple weeks ago. It stuck out, I've been thinking about, and it was talking about the differences in suppression activities between Euro-Americans and Asians. So they had them do a task in which they were triggered purposely by visually disturbing stimuli, and then they had them basically control themselves, suppress their emotion, and then ask how they felt afterward. So that's the whole study. What they found was that the Americans and Asians, so the Euro Americans and the Asians, processed this emotion suppression differently in different parts of the brain. One used the frontal cortex, one used like the front middle part of the cortex. So it was just interesting to see how different societies affect an individual and their emotions and how they process those emotions. Americans felt a sense of threat when they were asked to suppress their emotions, which was pretty interesting to me because I think it explains, a lot of what I see or what I've even seen within myself. This is the task that we have to do as counselors and psychologists. We can't only look out, we have to look within and be honest about that. So it was just interesting. And then Asian Americans, they used, I believe it was the frontal cortex to suppress emotions or negative emotions. So it was just very interesting. I'm forgetting some of the details, but I'll be sure to recap on that in the next video as well, when I can give the authors the proper credit and read the actual complete article on these findings. Anger suppression. Anger suppression refers to the frequency with which angry feelings are experienced but not expressed. Spielberger, 1999. It is associated with conflict avoidance, guilt, irritability, decreased life satisfaction, rumination, and depressive symptoms. Example, Bridgewell and Chang, 1997. Gross and John, 2003. Copper and Epperson, 1996. Martin and Dahlin, 2007. Individuals who suppress their anger also have a stronger perception of lacking social support. So that they may not lack social support, but they have a stronger perception. They view themselves as lacking social support, even though they might not. And that's from Paul Fay and Hart, 1997. Thus, like emotion suppression in general, anger suppression is associated with psychological costs and maladjustment. I think this was kind of intuitive for me because I read in undergrad, and I did really well in undergrad, that, the theory of universal emotions, that everybody experiences like 5 or 6 basic emotions, some say 4, um, anger, happiness, surprise, disgust, and then, people quibble about whether 2 more of those emotions, sadness, uh, and 1 more should be included. But anyway, the idea is that anywhere you go, no matter what language you speak, you can share the same emotions that another person shares. And to me, that's pretty remarkable. With 8 billion people on the planet, nearly, you can go anywhere and somebody could know you and you can know them, at least through emotion. But going back to the article now, does suppression entail the same kinds of costs for everyone? Some research is beginning to show that the consequences of emotion suppression are dependent upon cultural context. So that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, but that's newer research. That is, back to the article, emotion suppression may not have detrimental consequences for everyone, and may occur more frequently in some groups and cultural contexts than others. So obviously, we're talking about Asian Americans more so than Asians, more so than European Americans, or Americans in general, I would say. I would extend that, generalize that to Americans, even though it has not been tested. I mean, just look at us. We're kind of a noisy, boisterous, emotion-filled bunch. Um, so it goes on to say that is, emotion suppression may not have detrimental consequences for everyone. Again, read that part. For instance, Butler, Lee, and Gross, 2007, found that women who held more Asian values, as measured by the Asian Values Scale, this is by Kim Atkinson and Yang, 1999, for example, interdependence, used emotion suppression more frequently in daily life than those holding predominantly European American values, as measured by the European American Values Scale. Wolf, Yang, Wong, and Atkinson, 2001. For example, independence. That's more of a American value. And also expression, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, things like that as well. Moreover, they found that cultural values moderated the relation between emotion suppression and negative social outcomes. Suppression did not elicit as negative responses from social partners for women holding more Asian values compared to those who held more European values. The present study also raised the question about the moderating effect of cultural values on suppression's impact, but now in the domain of depression. Moreover, the focus of the present study was on the discrete emotion of anger, because anger has been theorized to be especially threatening to individuals with an interdependent self-construal that prioritizes relational harmony. Marcus and Katayama, 1991. I also believe that you could prioritize interdependence as well as relational harmony, but still engage in freedom of expression of emotion. I don't believe that they're mutually exclusive. I think of it kind of like, like if somebody from Asia were over here, we wouldn't probably get them to do something, like way outside of what their values are, right? And vice versa. I think that's one way that it could be thought of. Just cultural values. Theoretical model for the present study. Theoretical frameworks incorporating emotion regulation as an explanatory mechanism in the development of psychological disorders are just beginning to emerge. One such model was proposed by Yap, Allen, and Schieber, 2007, to show how emotion regulation is the critical mechanism through which temperament and family processes operate to increase vulnerability to depression. So how does emotion regulation and temperament mixed in with family processes, how does that come together to increase one's vulnerability to depression? Guided by this framework, we hypothesized that emotion regulation would mediate the influence of temperament and family processes on depression. The focus on depression is significant as it is a major public health concern and projected to become one of the leading causes of illness-related disability affecting the world's population. That's Murray and Lopez, 1996. Two important innovations were incorporated into this model. First, we examined anger suppression as one particular form of emotion regulation. Second, we tested two moderators of the depression link, race and interdependent self-construal. So how much one thinks of themselves as interdependent versus independent, like dependent on other people and appreciative of social harmony, is what we're saying. More valuing social harmony than the expression of a negative emotion. We also made three modifications to the model. Family processes were examined more generally versus those specifically focused on emotion socialization. The interaction term, temperament times the family processes, was excluded, and the model was tested on college students, which extends the age range of the original framework from adolescence into young adulthood. Figure 1 illustrates the theoretical model tested in the present study with the new components of anger suppression as a mediator and race and interdependent self-construal as moderators. So as a figure here, figure 1, trait anger. Everyone has different traits: blue eyes, brown eyes, tall, short. Trait anger is one part of this figure 1, and then just below it, family processes is another part. And then it has a connection between those two, how those two influence each other. How does trait anger influence family process, and how does family process influence trait anger? Then the next factor we have is anger suppression, like to the right of it, over here, and an arrow pointing from trait anger to anger suppression, and then family processes to anger suppression as well. So how do family processes impact one's anger suppression, and how does, well, it's only pointing that way. And how does trait anger impact anger suppression? Then from anger suppression to the next factor, depressive symptoms, which is what was spoken of as one of the dependent variables in this article. Race and interdependent self-construal was the one on the top, which is thought to be a mediator, something that affects the relationship, turns up the volume or turns down the volume of the impact of anger suppression on depressive symptoms. So race and interdependent self-construal can either turn up or turn down as a mediator, right? One that impacts one variable's effect on another. The hypothesized model of anger suppression and moderating effects of race and cultural orientation. Excuse me, I do need some water, but I'm not going to break this video. The mediating role of anger suppression. In applying Yap et al.'s 2007 theoretical model, we first present our rationale for why anger suppression is expected to mediate the influence of temperament and family processes on depression. Although temperament may be broadly construed for the purpose of the present study, we operationalize this construct by focusing on trait anger, which has been defined as the general propensity toward experiencing intense angry feelings over time. I didn't know that, actually. That's something I just learned. Like, you should know this. Spielberger, 1999. Spielberger, 1999. Previous research has documented that individuals with higher versus lower levels of trait anger tend to experience more intense angry feelings. In addition, they tend to display negative biases when processing semantic anger-related stimuli. That's Parrott, Zeichner, and Eves, 2005, and engage in more dysfunctional coping, such as frequent suppression or less controlled anger expression. Deffenbacher et al., 1996, which I think that's where catharsis could take over, which may in turn increase their vulnerability for psychological maladjustment. And that's the reason I state that. Family processes also play an important role in shaping emotion regulation strategies. Morris, Silk, Steinberg, Myers, and Robinson, 2007. In the present study, we operationalized family processes as family cohesion, family adaptability, and parent-adolescent communication, all of which contribute to the general emotional climate within a family context. It's interesting that they included family cohesion and family adaptability because I'm taking a class on systemic family therapy processes, and I was reading one article that talked about the more like family cohesion and family adaptability are inversely related. You know, the more family cohesion, less family adaptability, and then vice versa. But that's just one article, and that was just studied on a small group. So I don't know if it's generalizable, but it's just interesting to think about. So it talks about those processes, all of which contribute to the general emotional climate within a family context. A negative emotional climate within a family, as manifested by a lack of parent-child communication and emotional bonding among family members, has been associated with emotion dysregulation. See Rapetti, Taylor, and Seaman, 2002, for an extensive review, which may in turn be associated with depressive symptoms. For example, Brody, this is from Brody, Haga, Haaga, Kirk, and Solomon, 1999. A negative emotional climate within the family has been associated with elevated depressive symptomology among Asian American families as well. See Park, Kim, Chung, and Kim in Press for a review. Although there is some work by Ruth Chow, for example, Chow, 1994, indicating that authoritarian parenting processes may be associated with positive outcomes such as high academic achievement. So do as I say, not as I do. Not really so indicative of high warmth and high communication, which is the authoritative parenting processes. It's saying that authoritarian parenting processes may be associated with positive outcomes such as high academic achievement. Finally, emotion suppression has been shown to be positively associated with depressive symptomology in multiple non-clinical undergraduate samples. For example, Gross and John, 2003, found that habitual suppressors tend to report more depressive symptoms versus those who reappraise an emotion regulation strategy, who use a reappraisal as an emotion regulation strategy. So it looks like in that study, it was found that using a reappraisal strategy was better in terms of depressive symptoms than a suppression strategy. So reappraising a situation thinking of the situation in a different way that may be adaptive or beneficial. How can I look at this as a positive instead of a negative, a plus instead of a minus, a win instead of a loss? And that's research by Bridgewell and Chang, 1997, Copper and Epperson, 1996. Excuse me. Thus, the rationale for the present study's hypothesis regarding anger suppression as a mediator has been supported by theoretical and empirical evidence. To date, there have been no empirical tests of this model across racial or cultural groups. Thus, one purpose of the study was to test the cross-cultural applicability of this model. Culture, anger suppression, and depression. Within the broader literature on the influence of culture on emotion, Ekman, 1972, Matsumoto, 1993, Mesquita and Frege, 1992, Soto, Levinson, and Ebling, 2005, Tasai, 2007. The importance of cultural context with regard to emotion regulation is beginning to be empirically and theoretically established. Butler, Lee, and Gross, 2007, Katayama, Karasawa, and Mesquita, 2004, Mesquita and Albert, 2007. Although some research has identified racial and cultural differences and similarities in average levels, mean levels of emotion regulation strategies, Butler, Lee, and Gross, 2007, Gross and John, 2003, Matsumoto et al., 2008, there is much less empirical research that tests the association between emotion regulation and psychological adjustment across cultures. Moreover, prior research has often neglected to explicitly measure culture despite making cultural attributions, or has utilized crude proxies for culture. For example, assuming that race, ethnicity, or nation labels represent culture. Thus, one major aim of the present study was to address these gaps in the literature by testing the moderating effects of race and cultural values via an interdependent self-construal in the association between anger suppression and depression. So how does race and cultural values moderate that effect between anger suppression, like actively thinking, okay, I'm not going to get upset, and depression? How does one's race and how does one's cultural values turn up the volume on that or turn down the volume on that to have a greater impact on depression or a lesser impact on a resulting outcome of depression? That's what this study sought to analyze. There is emerging evidence suggesting that the consequences of suppression are moderated by cultural context. For example, Butler, Lee, and Gross, 2007, demonstrated that the negative social impact of suppression was attenuated among female undergraduates who adhered to more Asian versus predominantly European values. For individuals who held more Asian values, suppression was thought to serve pro-social goals versus a self-protective function for those holding more Western values. That's pretty interesting. Asian values, for those who held more Asian values, suppression of anger was thought to serve pro-social goals versus a self-protective function for those holding Western values. So suppression be more protecting oneself, I guess, of another person's critique or what's the word? Thinking of one probably having social consequences, right? In theoretical terms, Katayama, Karasawa, and Mesquita, 2004, have posited that culture shapes emotional experience through collective and personal processes. So the culture that we are in shapes our emotional experience, collectively and personally, through personal processes. That ties back into the systemic family therapy models that talk about problems and presenting problems when someone comes into therapy, or any symptoms that one has, as not thought of simply as just a product of the individual, but a product of the interactions that the person has with their family or with the environment. So that's the systemic nature of things. How multiple variables affect an individual and the effects throughout time. Specifically, they propose that cultural models of self-independent versus interdependent self-construals critically shape the ways in which individuals regulate their emotions. Further, they assert that emotion regulation strategies are culturally reinforced to serve either interdependent or independent goals. As defined by Marcus and Katayama, 1991, the interdependent model of self emphasizes connectedness with other people. The self becomes meaningful only in the larger context of social relationships. Individuals with a stronger interdependent self-construal tend to suppress or avoid angry feelings in order to maintain social harmony. That's as indicated by data from Asian and Asian heritage samples, Marcus and Katayama, 1991. Thus, anger suppression may be one form of emotion regulation that promotes social engagement and psychological well-being for interdependent individuals. In the present study, we expect that a strong interdependent self-control, regardless of one's race, would attenuate the relation between anger suppression and depression. The present study, in sum, the purpose of the present study was to examine both etic, which is universal, and emic, cultural specific, dimensions of emotion regulation and its association with depression. We sought to achieve this dual purpose by testing the cross-cultural applicability of an etic model, it's a universal model, of emotion regulation on a sample of Asian Americans, American and European American college students. We also incorporated an emic element to this model by examining differential associations between anger suppression and depression by testing race and interdependent self-construal as moderators of that relationship. Specifically, the present study tested two hypotheses. First, we hypothesized that anger suppression would mediate the effects of trait anger and family processes on depressive symptoms. We explicitly tested the previously held assumption that this model would apply across racial and cultural groups. Second, we hypothesized that race and an interdependent self-control would moderate the anger suppression depression link, such that the relation between anger suppression and depression symptom would be attenuated for Asian Americans and for individuals with a relatively strong versus weak interdependent self-control. So I think they meant symptoms there. It has the methods. There was 365 college students, 165 self-identified Asian Americans, and 200 self-identified European Americans at a private Midwestern university. They ranged in age from 18 to 28 years old. The average age, the mean, was 19.3 years old, standard deviation of 1.3 years. The sample was 55.9% female. Seemed like a pretty good study. The largest proportions of Asian Americans were Chinese, at 29.1%, and Korean 25.5%, followed by Vietnamese 11.5%, Filipino 11.9%, Asian Indian 6.7%, other Asian 5.5%, biracial, multiracial 3.6%, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander 2.4%, and Japanese 1.8%, with 5% missing this data. The vast majority, 90%, of European Americans identified as European American, white, or Caucasian. The remaining 10% identified with more specific European ancestries, German, Irish, Swedish, for example. Participants were recruited through A, the psychological department subject pool, B, on-campus student organizations, C, student listservs, and D, mass mailings. Participants either received research credit in psychology courses or were entered into a drawing for $15, $25, or $50 bookstore gift certificates. The study was approved by the Institutional Review Board prior to implementation. Informed consent was obtained from all participants prior to the survey administration. Measures. Trait anger. Trait anger was measured by a 10-item trait anger scale of the State Trait Anger Expression Inventory, Staxi 2, Spielberger, 1999. The scale is divided into two components: angry temperament, i.e. a disposition towards experiencing anger without specific anger provocation, and angry reaction, i.e. the frequency of experiencing anger feelings in situations involving negative evaluations and frustration. Participants rated each item on a 4-point Likert scale from 1, almost never, to 4, almost always. The trait anger scale has demonstrated good internal consistency in non-clinical adult samples. Alphas are 0.84 through 0.86, Spielberger, 1999, and in Asian samples, alphas are 0.82 to 0.85, Bishop and Kwa, 1998. In the current study, the anger temperament and anger reaction subscales demonstrated acceptable internal consistency with Cronbach alphas of 0.85 and 0.74 respectively. Family adaptability and cohesion. The family adaptability and cohesion evaluation scales 2, family version, which is phases 2, Olson, McCubbin, Barnes, Larson, Muxon, and Wilson, 1982, was used to measure family adaptability and cohesion. The adaptability and cohesion subscales contained 14 and 16 items respectively. Participants were asked to rate each item on a 5-point Likert scale from 1, almost never, to 5, almost always. A sample item from the adaptability subscale, quote, each family member has input regarding major family decisions, quote, unquote. A sample item from the cohesion subscale is, quote, family members are supportive of each other during difficult times, end quote. The composite scores were calculated using a weight summation procedure, which accounted for both positive and negative items. Olson et al., 1982. Both the cohesion and adaptability subscales have previously demonstrated good internal consistency among Asian American college students with alpha coefficients of 0.84 and 0.91 respectively. Lee, Ko, Kim, and Ngo, 2000. Good internal consistency was also obtained in the current study for the cohesion. Alpha is equal to 0.80 and adaptability alpha is equal to 0.82 subscales. Parent-adolescent communication. The Parent and Adolescent Communication Scale, PAC, Barnes and Olson, 1985, was used to measure college students' perceptions of the overall quality of communication with their father and mother, respectively. The PAC, or PAC, is comprised of two subscales, openness and problems with communication. A sample item for the openness subscale is, quote, I find it easy to discuss problems with my father and mother, end quote. A sample item for the problems with communication subscale is, quote, there are topics I avoid discussing with my father and mother, end quote. Participants were asked to rate each item on a 5-point Likert scale from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. with higher scores indicating a higher quality of communication. The pack has demonstrated good internal consistency in prior research, with alpha equaling 0.88 for the total scale, Barnes and Olson 1985, and alpha 0.76 for a Cambodian youth sample, that's Daly 2006. Because the mother-child and father-child communication subscales were significantly correlated, the correlation coefficient R is equal to 0.38, p-value less than 0.001. That's greater than a 99.9% confidence interval. They were averaged to form one composite measure reflecting quality of communication with both parents. So they averaged both of those scales to determine the measure of quality of communication with both parents. The combined PAC, Parent and Adolescent Communication Scale, demonstrated excellent internal consistency in the current study. The alpha was 0.94. The measures, the measure or scale, the questions on the measure or scale related to one another very well, 0.94. So 1 would be a perfect correlation, 0.94 is a very good correlation. Anger suppression. Anger suppression was measured by the anger expression in subscale of the State Trait Anger Expression Inventory, STAXI-2, Spielberger 1989. The subscale contains 8 items accessing the frequency with which individuals suppress the angry feelings that they experience. Participants were asked to rate each item on a 4-point Likert scale from 1 almost never to 4 almost always. The anger expression in subscale has demonstrated adequate internal consistency with reliability alphas of 0.76 female and 0.74 male in non-clinical adult samples, Spielberger 1999. The STAXI-2 has also been successfully administered in Asian American adults. For example, Kim and Zhang 2004, the subscale demonstrated acceptable internal consistency in the current study. Alpha is equal to 0.75. Self-Construal. The 24-item Self-Construal scale, SCS, Singlis 1994, contains two 12-item subscales assessing interdependent and independent self-controls respectively on a 7-point Likert scale ranging from 1 strongly disagree to 7 strongly agree. The current study focused on the interdependent self-construal. It focused on the interdependent self-construal subscale. One sample is, quote, "It is important for me to maintain harmony with my group," end quote. The SCS has demonstrated adequate internal consistency in prior research with alpha coefficients ranging from 0.71 to 0.73, Sato and McCann, 1998, Singlis and Sharkey, 1995, Singlis, Trandis, Bawok, and Goldfond, 1995. The SCS, that's self-construal scale again, has been administered to Asian samples. For example, Kawan, Bond, and Singlis, 1997. The interdependent self-construal subscale demonstrated acceptable internal consistency in the current study. Alpha is equal to 0.73. Depressive symptoms. The Beck Depression Inventory, BDI, Beck, Ward, Mendelsohn, and Herbach, 1961, is a 21-item measure assessing cognitive, affective, behavioral, and somatic aspects of depression. Respondents were asked to rate each item on a scale from 0 to 3 to reflect the intensity of a symptom during the past week. For example, degree of sadness, with higher scores indicating a higher level of depression. Previous meta-analysis of the BDI have demonstrated good reliabilities with psychiatric and non-psychiatric samples, with alpha coefficients of 0.86 and 0.81 respectively. Beck, Steer, Garvin, 1988. The BDI demonstrated good internal consistency in the current study. The alpha was 0.87. Results. Table 1 shows zero-order correlations, means, and standard deviations for all study variables. The correlations supported the theorized associations from trait anger and family processes to anger suppression. The PS was less than 0.001 confidence interval, greater than 99.9%, as well as between anger suppression and depressive symptoms. The correlation coefficient R is equal to 0.47. P-value is less than 0.001. Again, same confidence interval. Gender and age were not associated with the study variables. PS is greater than 0.05, and thus were not included in the subsequent analysis. So it has all the variables here. Variables, number 1, gender, age. Number 2, 3, interdependent self-construal. Number 4, angry temperament. Number 5, angry reaction. Number 6, parent-adolescent communication. Number 7, family adaptability. Number 8, family cohesion. Number 9, anger suppression. And number 10, depressive symptoms. Mean level racial and cultural differences in emotion suppression were examined using independent sample t-tests. Results indicated that Asian Americans, mean equal 20.13, standard deviation 4.39, reported significantly higher levels of anger suppression than European Americans. The average, the mean, is 18.31, standard deviation is 4.22. The T363 is equal to negative 4.02, p-value of less than 0.001, so 99.9% confidence interval. Individuals who were high versus low on interdependent self-control did not significantly differ on anger suppression. T363, participants equals negative 1.27, p-value is 0.21, although the means were in the expected direction, with more interdependent individuals reporting more anger suppression. The average or mean is 19.43, standard deviation 4.38, than those who were less interdependent. The average is 18.85, standard deviation 4.38. Anger suppression as a mediator, testing the theorized model across race. So multi-sample CFA, as recommended by Anderson, Gerbing, 1998, Klein, 2005, showed an acceptable fit of the measurement model to the data among Asian Americans and European Americans. The chi-squared is 76, is equal to 147.29. P-value, again, 99.9 confidence interval. It's 0.001 p-value. CFI is equal to 0.96, and FI is equal to 0.94. RMSEA is equal to 0.07. Multi-sample SEM was then used to test the proposed model. Acceptable model fits were obtained for the configural invariance. Chi-squared 76 is equal to 147.28. P-value is less than 0.001. CFI is 0.96. NNF is equal to 0.94. RMSEA is equal to 0.07. And factorial invariance, chi-squared is 85, is equal to 159.68. P-value is less than 0.001. CFI, again, is 0.96. And FI is 0.94. RMSEA is 0.07. Models across Asian Americans and European Americans. The chi-squared difference between the models for configural model 1.1 and factorial invariance model 2.1 was non-significant. Delta chi-squared 7 is 12.39, p-value greater than 0.05, indicating factorial invariance across racial groups. Significant indirect effects from trait anger and family processes to depressive symptoms, demonstrated the mediating role of anger suppression for both racial groups. The PS is less than 0.05, providing support for our hypothesis. And it says, see Table 2. Table 2 is unstandardized path coefficients for mediation model by race and interdependent self-construal. It has the model 2.1 factorial invariance, then it has the variable race next to it, and then interdependent self-construal next to that. It has just under the factorial intervariance on the left-hand side, parameter estimates, structural model. Underneath that, covariance, and then underneath that, trait anger and family processes. Under that, direct effects, and then again, trait anger effect on anger suppression, family processes effect on anger suppression, trait anger effect on depressive symptoms, family processes effect on depressive symptoms, anger suppression effect on depressive symptoms. And then it has indirect effects, trait anger on depressive symptoms, family processes on depressive symptoms. And then it has the p-values, either 99, 99.9% confidence interval, and then 95%. P-value of 0.05, p-value of 0.01, or p-value of 0.001. Testing the theorized models across levels of interdependent self-construal. Using a median split, the total sample was divided into two groups, low versus high, by interdependent self-construal. Multi-sample CFA showed an acceptable fit of measurement model to the data across these two groups. Chi-square of 76 is 130.26, p-value is 0.001, CFI is 0.97, and NFI is 0.96, RMSEA is 0.06. Multi-sample SEM was then used to test the proposed model. Satisfactory model fits were obtained for configural and factorial invariance across groups. See Table 3. The chi-square difference between the models for configural, it's model 1.1, and factorial invariance, model 2.1, was non-significant. Chi-x squared of 7 is 2.07, p-value is greater than 0.05, indicating factorial invariance across groups. Indirect effects from trait anger and family processes to depressive symptoms for both groups were significant, indicating the mediating role of anger suppression, PS is less than 0.05, with the exception of the family processes depression effect for the high interdependent self-construal group. Thus, our first hypothesis was generally supported. See Table 2. Table 3, summary statistics for models tested across Asian Americans versus European Americans. The models are chi-squared, DF, P, CFI, NNFI, RMSEA, chi-squared, delta, well, these aren't the models, but those are the variables, delta chi-squared, delta DF, and another P. The types of models are the configural invariance, factorial invariance, and path equivalence. And you can look at that as well. Moderation by race is the next part. Cultural moderation by interdependent self-construal is the next part, how they tested for it, and then the discussion. So I'll go into that. The present study tested a theoretical model of emotion regulation and its association with depressive symptoms among college students. From an etic perspective, we tested the generalizability of a mainstream model of emotion regulation, Yap et al. 2007, among two racial groups, Asian American and European American, and two culturally defined groups, those who were relatively high versus low on interdependent self-construal. From an emic perspective, we tested the racial and cultural moderation of the anger suppression, depression link in the model. This integrated approach allowed us to examine the external validity of a theoretical model as well as the culture-specific boundary conditions for this model. The study's main findings are unique in that they represent the first attempt to not only test this emotion regulation model cross-culturally, but also to test the cultural moderation of the relation between anger suppression and depression symptoms among college students. The SEM results showed that anger suppression was a significant mediator of the effects of trait anger and family processes on college students' depressive symptoms, regardless of their race and level of interdependent self-construal. The present results also indicated that the model must be considered in light of race and cultural context because the anger suppression depression link was attenuated by an Asian American status and higher levels of interdependent self-construal. These novel findings build upon and are consistent with some emerging research in the area of emotion regulation. First, the test of Yap et al. 2007 model of emotion regulation extends this theoretical work by providing initial empirical evidence on the applicability of the model to Asian Americans and European Americans with varying levels of interdependent self-construal. The results also extend the potential age range of the model to include emerging adults. Second, the general good fit of the mediation model demonstrated that anger suppression does contain costs with regard to mental health outcomes, specifically depressive symptomology. This is consistent with prior findings that emotion suppression is often associated with negative psychosocial consequences. Gross and John, 2003. Third, the results make an important contribution towards building the empirical knowledge base on how race and culture may moderate the relation between emotion regulation and psychological adjustment. Culture has a big thing to do with how it could moderate it. The finding that anger suppression was less detrimental vis-a-vis depressive symptoms among individuals who were highly interdependent is similar to that of a prior study, Butler et al. 2007, which indicated that the negative consequences of expressive suppression in social interactions was reduced for women who held bicultural Asian European values. In addition, the relation between anger regulation and adolescence adjustment problems has also been found to be moderated by Self-Construal, Park and Kim, 2009. The current study is noteworthy because it is the first to show cultural moderation of the emotion suppression outcome link with regard to depressive symptoms among college students. Methodologically, the study addressed some gaps in the current emotion regulation literature. Given prior recommendations, John and Gross 2004, we closely examined the regulation of one discrete emotion, namely anger, rather than studying emotion regulation in a global manner. The focus on anger was also advantageous from a cultural perspective in that this emotion has demonstrated great variability across cultures in terms of psychological and social impact. Kitayama et al. 2004, Marcus and Kitayama 1991. Very little empirical research in this area has investigated the role of cultural context, and this study was designed to do exactly that. Finally, the study tested mediation and moderation using SEM, which captures measurement error and afforded the use of multiple measures for some constructs, for example, family processes. Limitations and future directions. The present study's findings must be interpreted in light of its limitations, which also point to directions for future research. First, the study was cross-cultural in design, and thus neither causality nor direction of effects can be inferred. Future studies should examine the constructs longitudinally to establish their temporal sequence. Example D.A., Cole, and Maxwell, 2003. Second, given the present sample of undergraduates, it is uncertain the degree to which the family processes construct was salient, since most students did not typically live with their families. At the same time, the significance of family processes in impacting the affective and psychological state of young adults should not be downplayed, as demonstrated in prior studies. H. Wang and Wood, 2009. Third, this college student sample may not be representative of the general population of emerging adults whose educational levels may vary. So it may not be indicative of the entire general population. Generalize these findings. Future studies should test the generalizability of these results across diverse groups and settings. For example, community-based and clinical samples, different age ranges across genders, acculturation levels, and other ethnic populations. Fourth, the present study examined cultural influences via self-construal. However, there are numerous ways in which cultural context may be operationalized. Future research should capitalize on other important cultural constructs associated with emotion regulation in its consequences, such as acculturation, face concern, that's Zane and Ye, 2002, and power distance, Hofstede, 1980. Finally, the study assessed the variables of interest via self-report and future research should explore multiple methods of assessment. For example, behavioral and physiological indicators of emotion suppression. Implications for theory research and clinical practice. The current findings also point to some implications for theory, research, and clinical practice. The results offer empirical support for Yap et al.'s 2007 model, particularly for the central mediating role of emotion regulation as an important explanatory mechanism linking temperament and family processes with depression. However, the universality of this theoretical model is limited by certain cultural parameters, for example, levels of interdependent self-construal. With regard to future research, then, there are at least two implications. Theory-driven models of emotion regulation should continue to be empirically tested in order to verify or falsify their applicability across diverse populations and settings. At the same time, cultural context must also be thoughtfully considered, and emic dimensions of models should be tested as well. For instance, future research can consider whether and how culture may moderate other linkages in this model. Finally, in terms of practice, clinicians who are engaged in intervention and prevention efforts aimed at reducing depression among college students should consider targeting an individual's emotion regulation strategies as one malleable mechanism that may be associated with depressive symptomology. So basically, look at the emotion regulation strategies and, different emotion regulation strategies and see how each one impacts depression levels. Clinicians should also be aware of their clients' self-construals, how they see themselves as valuing social harmony or valuing independence, which may differentially influence the negative impact of an emotion regulation strategy, such as anger suppression, on mental health outcomes, such as depressive symptoms. So self-construals might be a factor that can be turned up or down as well to see how it impacts the emotion regulation strategy for anger suppression, and then that effect of anger suppression on mental health outcomes like depression or symptoms of depression. More simply put, some emotion regulation strategies may not have as negative an impact on some individuals as others, depending on their self-construal. So I guess if one starts to think maybe, I'm about social harmony, that's what I value most, then their suppression of their negative emotion or anger may not impact their depression as much. I guess that's what that's saying there. In conclusion, but it did state that across both Asian Americans and Euro Americans, it was a factor, a mediator, and it impacted depressive symptoms as the outcome. In conclusion, the present study integrated etic and emic approaches to test a theoretical model of emotion regulation, Yap et al. 2007, in a sample of Asian American and European American college students. The findings are one of the first of its kind in testing the cross-cultural applicability of this model. Moreover, the results highlighted the importance of cultural context in demonstrating the moderation of the anger suppression-depression link by interdependent self-construal. Understanding both universal and cultural-specific aspects of the role of emotion regulation in the development of depression and other forms of psychopathology will be essential in effective prevention and intervention efforts across diverse populations. As acknowledgments as well, the second author was supported in this research in part by the Asian American Center on Disparities Research, that's National Institute of Mental Health grant, IP 50 MH073511-01A2. We would like to thank members of the Culture and Family Processes Lab for assistance in data collection and data entry. We would also like to thank Scott E. Maxwell, Robert Pereira, and Ki-Hai Wan for their statistical consultation. As footnotes here as well, the publisher's disclaimer: the following manuscript is the final accepted manuscript. It has not been subjected to the final copy editing, fact-checking, and proofreading required for formal publication. I guess that's why I found that one little error that needs editing. It is not the definitive publisher authenticated version. The American Psychological Association and its Council of Editors disclaim any responsibility or liabilities for errors or omissions of this manuscript version. Any version derived from this manuscript by NIH or other third parties, the published version of this is available at www.apa.org/pubs/journals/CDP. Has the references here as well. Once again, my name is Eric Michael Loyd. I have a master's in psychology, neuropsychology concentration. I'm reading the journal article titled Anger Suppression, Interdependent Self-Construal, and Depression Among Asian American and European American College Students, written by Rebecca Y.M. Chung and Irene J.K. Park. Thank you again for your time.